Welcome to Leading with Empathy and Allyship, where we have deep, real conversations to build empathy for one another and to take action to be more inclusive and to lead the change in our workplaces and communities. I'm Melinda Epler, founder and CEO of Change Catalyst and author of How to Be an Ally. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion speaker, advocate, and advisor. You can learn more about my work and sign up to join us for a live recording at ally.cc. All right, let's dive in. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show. And while our show is titled Leading with Empathy and Allyship, we often focus a lot of our topics on allyship, each time working to build empathy as we learn about the unique experiences of our guests. And of course, allyship is empathy in action. And occasionally we do stop and really investigate empathy with Najiba Saeed and Kate Johnson, for example. We'll link to those episodes in our show notes. So today we're going to take a break and talk a lot about empathy. Today our guest is Dr. Komal Bhasin, Senior DEI Consultant and Mental Health Expert in Resident at Bhasin Consulting Incorporated. We'll be talking about how empathy can be learned, the science and theory behind it, and practically what we can do if empathy doesn't come naturally. We'll also spend some time talking about how to tap into our empathy during times of collective grief and suffering, where we're centering empathy and allyship and holding space for communities who really need it. And even though we might have marginalized identities ourselves and experience marginalization ourselves, and we'll talk specifically about Ukraine, as this is on so many of our minds right now. So Komal, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Melinda.
Yeah. Our interpreters today are Sarika and Anita from our partners at Interpreter Now, www.interpreter-now.com. And the first thing we usually do is describe ourselves for the YouTube audience, for anybody who is blind or low vision. So I'll start. I am a white woman. I have my hair up today, so it's kind of reddish blondish, and I'm wearing a blue shirt, blue V-neck shirt, and behind me is on one side is a desk with my book, How to Be an Ally, and with a orange cover and plants around it and a lamp, and on the other side is a small bookshelf with a plant and a few other things on it.
I am a South Asian woman. I am wearing a blue sweater with a gold necklace and a little emblem. And I am, my background is a landscape painting, abstract landscape painting.
Awesome. So can you start by just telling us a bit about who you are, your story, where you grew up, how you ended up doing the work that you do?
Sure, happy to. So I am calling in from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, which is my home sits on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I was born in the outer Toronto, suburb areas to Punjabi Sikh parents who immigrated here from India. And I grew up as the child of immigrants in a country where they were trying to build their lives, looking to adjust, fit in, raise their children as well as possible with the influences of two cultures and many other cultures that were around us. Being the child of immigrants was hugely forming for me in terms of my exposure to culture and difference and different ways of being and building my comfort level, being around different types of people, especially in such a diverse city. And my father wore a turban and wears a turban as a symbol of his and our Sikh faith. And that was also a hugely forming experience for me to be raised and come of age alongside someone who so overtly stands out in any crowd, and as a result of which we experienced many different types of interactions with people, including having the experiences of allyship and empathy that were much needed in various moments and my upbringing in our lives together, but then also experiences of exclusion and oppression and overt racism. And I think those experiences really helped me form my life path. I became a social worker at a young age, really went to school really young and became a social worker pretty young by like 21. And then,
Wow.
and then went on to study some more in the health sciences and then earned a doctorate more recently. And I've just spent my life working in spaces around health equity, mental health, workplace mental health as well, and just inclusion. That's what brings me here.
Yeah. And so what is the work that you do now? What does that look like?
I work with organizations across sectors. So I have a private sector practice, a public sector practice, charitable not-for-profit practice as well. And I work with organizations that are looking to build their capacity for inclusion. So I do strategic planning, I do speaking and training, and a lot of individual one-on-one coaching to help people build their comfort level across difference and work more collaboratively across identities. And I do that work globally. Increasingly, given my mental health background, I'm working in organizations talking about mental health inclusion, burnout prevention, psychological safety, and just well-being in the workplace, which has never been more important than now for many of us.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing your story. And so a lot of your work, I'm sure, does in some way or another kind of center empathy. And that's what, when we talked about what we wanted to discuss today, it was clear that you wanted to talk about empathy. And so maybe we stop here, or we take a moment to define empathy. What is empathy for you? Why is it so important?
So, I guess the important thing for me to say is that, I'm a clinician by training, and I also have formal education and academic background in this kind of world. And so I have my personal definition, and then I have my more academic and scientific type definition. And both are important to me in different ways. So maybe I'll just say that my sense is that there's a general agreement across disciplines that empathy is the ability to imagine what another person is thinking and feeling, and to deeply and immersively experience the world of another person, the life world of another, in a way that allows us to call forth our compassion, support, actions, allyship that support another person. My personal view is that empathy is all about using our human and divine attributes that we all possess to show up in deep resonance with another being in order to live more fully, to connect more fully, to be more alive, to feel more whole, and to be healing and loving.
And why? Why is that so important in the workplace? How does empathy show up in the workplace, and why is it so important to kind of keep deepening our empathy?
I'm sure you talk about this all the time. We know that we spend a huge portion of our lives in the workplace. And, I, again, think about the social sciences, for example, and the human condition. One of the human needs that we have is to work, actually. Now, the work doesn't have to be in a formal workplace, but one of the needs that we have as human beings, and we often see this in animals too, that they need to be doing something, they need to work. So we need to work as humans. And if we're going to be spending most of our life, or vast majority of our life, doing things, and a lot of that being in a formal workplace, then those are the places where we need to be bringing our whole selves, our full lives, our full being. And those are the places where we then are going to be interacting with each other, connecting with each other, building relationships. To use a therapy term, I'm a clinician by training, but these are the places where we co-regulate, where our bodies, our nervous systems learn to either relax with each other and lean in to create and produce and to be effective, or create distance and feel a lack of safety and discomfort, which then has us in that state all day long. And so the workplace is the place to bring our whole selves and our lives together in a way that we don't have in other environments necessarily. And so the ability to connect with people wholly, to show kindness, to build across bridges, to be inclusive, it requires the skill of empathy.
Yeah, and I have noticed in my life, and that there are some people that have more empathy than others. And also that I've read a few studies showing that empathy can be learned, and that I personally have a growth mindset and about everyone. And I have seen, and I'm living proof that empathy can be learned. When I was growing up, grew up in a family that didn't really show empathy for each other, that didn't, that empathy muscle or skill was not in me at an early age. And I kind of realized when I was in my teenage years that as I went to college, actually, that I really wanted to change that. I didn't like how I showed up for other people. I wanted to show up in a different way. And so did a lot of work on myself to build empathy in myself and build compassion and understanding. And of course, now I teach people how to build empathy on their teams. And so I'm kind of living proof that is a possibility, that you can learn empathy. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. How do we learn empathy? How can empathy be learned? What is the science behind it? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, I'm happy to. So do my best here. It's a wide sort of world, this really, abstract term, empathy, and what does it mean? And, I always find it interesting when people say that that empathy is fixed. You either have it or you don't have it, or that it's like something that is really difficult to learn if you don't have the disposition for it, or that it's not really that important to learn. And I think that all of that is honestly speak for this thing is too abstract and too challenging and too nebulous for me to figure out, and it requires too much work. But actually, there are some general themes in the literature and the science around empathy. While it is a very broad field across many different disciplines, there are some sort of shared thoughts about what empathy is and how it can be learned. So generally speaking, empathy is sort of a combination of a disposition or a mood, some cognitive traits, as well as affect, feelings, and then action, and bringing those things together in a combination. So in the literature, there's some research by DocSocsci and colleagues, and I think their research is really offers a simple way of thinking about the components of empathy that work together. And they describe 4 components. So affect sharing. Empathy involves the ability to feel what another person might be feeling. Number 2, self-awareness. This is about having the sense of your own thoughts, feelings, and your strengths and limitations as they relate to showing up for another person and supporting another person. So that self-awareness is key. The 3rd component is mental or cognitive capacity. And this is the ability to imagine another person's situation from the inside out, like to adopt the subjective perspective of another person. So that involves, mental capacity to do that. And then the 4th one that's described by DocSocsci is emotional regulation, the ability to manage our own emotion in appropriate ways. So for example, you're looking to show empathy to somebody else, but you're able to manage your own emotions, even though you're deeply feeling what they might be feeling. But there's a sense of appropriateness. And I'll just add another component there, which is increasingly being talked about in the literature on empathy, and that's conscious actioning. That's my own term, but this idea of that we have the choice to act in support of one another. We have the choice to show up and take that experience of empathy and then turn it into action. And in this way, empathy is directly related to allyship, because allyship is about action. And that's, to me, where those two concepts really come together.
So taking that, and I read a study that showed that 72% of CEOs say that the current state of allyship in the workplace needs to change. And in the tech industry specifically, there's another study that showed that 96% of people in the tech industry feel their colleagues have difficulty demonstrating empathy. And it is really, I love that I usually talk about empathy as being a combination of insight and engagement. That on one side, you're doing the work to learn and to deeply understand what somebody's experiencing on their own terms, and then you work to show them empathy. And then the third piece of that is as allies, that we step up and take action as a result of that. And I love that you kind of laid that out in a slightly different way, but it ends up in the same place where we are learning about somebody's unique experiences, and we're figuring out ways to support them. So given that kind of lack of empathy in our workplaces, and I'm sure so many listeners have experienced that in our, whether it's managers that are not showing empathy in times of crisis or times where they really need it, or it is, it's just a general culture that lacks empathy across global teams, or for example, really understanding each other across global teams and working together with deeper empathy. And of course, it leads to innovation and all kinds of things. So a lot of managers are looking for ways to build empathy on their teams. Any thoughts about how we can do that in our workplaces? How can managers start to build more empathy across their teams, for example?
Yeah, for sure. The first thing that comes to mind for me, and this is a moment of me sort of enacting some empathy for managers, is that managers have the toughest job, frankly, and often have the toughest jobs. And during this time, the pandemic, our global spotlight on injustice that we're experiencing, what we have had over the last couple of weeks with the invasion of Ukraine, managers carry the responsibility for people. And from a perspective of showing empathy, for a moment, let me just say that it is very hard to show up for other people and to be empathetic when we ourselves are depleted. And of the group of people in the workplace right now who have been incredibly depleted, who repeatedly are being asked to dig deeper, show up for your people, you're in leadership, so this is what you signed up for. This is part of the work that you've undertaken and chosen to be in the seat that you're in. Dig deeper, and it is very, very hard to do that at your best capacity of empathy when you're depleted yourself. So let me just start with that acknowledgement, because I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge for leaders that you're being asked to do more when you're being asked to show up and build your team and be empathetic and hold space for them during this tough time, and otherwise, while you might also be going through a hard time. And I went through the sort of 4 components and then adding action, 5 aspects or components of allyship, and pretty much every single one of them: emotional regulation, self-awareness, cognitive ability, all of them require our prefrontal cortex. They all require the modern part of our brain that is unique to us as humans, that is where our executive functioning sits. So it's the part of our brain, smallest little baby bit of our brain, but the smallest part of our brain that does that heavy lifting. And that part of our brain needs to feel safe, needs to feel relaxed, needs to be in good shape, needs to be well rested, needs to have slept, all of those things in order to be empathetic. So let me just start with that. How do we build empathetic teams? We take care of ourselves as individuals first, and we build the capacity to do that. Secondarily, though, when we're in those spaces where we have people whose wellness and well-being is being thought about and cared about, including ourselves, we can show up and create spaces for generative dialogue. I really believe that organizations and teams in particular that take the time to relate to one another as a core priority of doing the work that they do. So like, it's not just the task, it's not just the project, it's not just the getting the end result or getting the thing out the door or finishing, to the deadline or whatever it is. Teams that integrate generative discussion and integrate the space to share about each individual in their lives, like that are actually being, and this is also, falls in line with inclusion, creating space for people to talk about themselves, their lives, their experiences, their life world, is what we call in academia, like creating space for people to share their life world will naturally, intuitively build empathy. And so it's a small thing, and it's a thing that your team might not even consciously know is happening, but it's a micro sort of step that can be taken to start to build empathy, to allow people space to talk about themselves and their experiences at work.
Awesome. And then for people who on your team, for example, that aren't showing empathy for each other, can you recommend anything that a manager can do to kind of touch base with them, check in with them, and help them build that skill? Yeah.
So, for the first thing that I would do is if I notice someone as a recipient of a microaggression, of some kind of behavior that I think might be harmful to them, I'd be checking in with them. So that's also sort of like data collection for you as a manager, right? So the intuitive thought might be to go straight to the person that engaged in the bad behavior and deal with them. But actually, I would really pause on that and go to the person. It's actually a really great inclusion muscle to build as a leader too, to check in with the person, because it actually has you testing your assumptions about who's experiencing a microaggression, who might not be, how they might be feeling, and testing that out actually for your own learning as well. So I'd actually go to that person first and sort of say, what was that experience like for you? I noticed this. Was I wrong? How do you feel? What can I do to support you? And anything else you want to share there. With that information, I would also be asking, depending on what the behavior is, I might be asking, would you have a comfort level with me supporting you in addressing this? And they might say, no, absolutely not. And they might say, yes, as long as you kind of do it lightly. And a few or much smaller number of people would say, yes, absolutely, I need you to speak on my behalf. But I think a smaller number of people might say, yes, but, and give you their parameters. Like, don't say my name entirely, or don't say that I told you, or whatever it might be. And I think that needs to be respected. And then I would, of course, go to the person who I feel engages in behavior that needs to be adapted and checked, and they need to be developed and coached to coach them, into more appropriate behavior. And I would, in my view, and this is how I lead, have a kind, so I'm tuning into my own capacity to be empathetic, conversation with them about what I observed and how that might have made the other person feel. And my first step would be to say, what's going on with you? And this is where self-coaching as a leader is so important, because you need to be checking your own biases about, there's a bias that I'm sure you've talked about a bunch of times called the recency bias, which is that we have a tendency to treat a person or see a person as on the basis of our most recent interaction with them. So if we've noticed a couple of weeks of someone kind of not being quite themselves and being a bit more bullying, or being, microaggressing a little bit more, or whatever it might be, we might have a tendency to just see them that way and then label them that way. But we might also, and we do also want to take a pause and say, how do I actually know this person? What have they always been like what have my interactions with them been like? Why am I bringing this up now if this has been going on for a while? And so what's changed for me? But importantly, is this new behavior for this individual? Is this the first time I'm sort of noticing this? And can I show up with empathy as I do a check-in? And of course, I have a mental health background, and a mental health inclusion in the workplace background. So naturally, my view is going to be, how are you doing? What's going on for you? My conversation with person A, who I noticed being treated a certain way and I was worried about, would not be very dissimilar to my conversation with the person who is quote unquote the perpetrator, because I'd be wanting to check in. Usually, for those of us that have created teams that we enjoy working with, that we care about and that we really like, and are enjoying our work, usually there's something going on for the individual and they're willing and open to being coached, and they need that sense again of co-regulation, safety, to have a conversation with their manager that would then move their behavior forward. So when we approach that conversation with empathy ourselves, with kindness and openness, and a mental health and wellness and well-being kind of perspective, we're much more likely to achieve the change we want to achieve in terms of their behavior.
So we're modeling empathy as we're working with other people to build that empathy. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. I'm also thinking about a few episodes ago, we talked with Yvonne Hutchinson about how to talk to your boss about race. And I'm thinking also about people that may have managers who are experiencing a lot right now. Perhaps they are more limited in their capacity to show empathy for each other because there is so much stress in their own lives. And I'm just thinking about, is there a way that people can approach their managers about showing more empathy? If perhaps their manager is not really in touch with some of the experiences that people are having on the team, or something is happening at a kind of global scale, like the murder of George Floyd or the anti-Asian hate in the U.S. and so much of the right now LGBTQIA plus, anti-LGBTQIA plus, especially anti-trans legislation, and the war in Palestine earlier, and it's on so many people's minds now. The Russian war against Ukraine. There's a lot of managers that are just ignoring it, not talking about it, or not talking about what's going on in people's lives right now. Is there any recommendation that you have first for people that want their managers to show up in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, so much of these types of conversations, they require this foundational thing that we all talk about, but really, again, another topic like empathy, tough for people to lean in on and lean into, and that psychological safety. So the first thing that I would say is that we all have an intuitive sense of whether we feel safe speaking up with another person. We know it. We actually experience that probably every day in our lives, where we share something that's more intimate and private about our lives, including something as simple as how I'm doing today. And with one person, I'll say fine. And with another person, I'll tell them that I'm not doing fine and go into detail. And that is like, we won't even know that we're doing that throughout the day, but that's an intuitive knowing of whether we feel safe with this person, right? And so there will be people who do not have a sense of safety bringing that type of topic or conversation up with their manager, and for lots of different reasons. And some of that would be rapport, psychological safety, trust, those kinds of things. And for those folks, I would say you may wish to have a conversation with your peers and your closest allies first, to strategize and brainstorm and think about whether someone else in that little group of people you consider to be your little cabinet of supporters in your workplace wants to step up an allyship potentially and speak on your behalf if you don't have the safety yourself, and strategize that. Go ahead and do that. But for those people who have good relationships with their managers and want to have a conversation with their manager about being more empathetic and showing more support, I use and you'll notice this the more and more we talk, that I will always go back to first principles around connection, resonance, mental well-being, and understanding the human condition from in terms of how the brain works, but then also how we manage and deal with stress in our lives. And when your manager is struggling to be empathetic, chances are that they're going through some stuff as well. And this is the thing, right? We all are going through our stuff. And this is why the more we show up and create generative, open spaces to share it and talk about it, the more the runway is built when we do need to have a difficult conversation. It's very hard to expect an employee or a manager who has never had the tough kind of conversation about race, about a microaggression that they were engaged in against another person, about addressing bullying behavior that's really intense. It will be very challenging to do that effectively the first time if they wait for the first time to be an extreme moment. So if the first time you're checking in with your staff ever around how they're doing is after the murder of a Black man on global site, or the first time we're checking in and mentioning an invasion of a country or war-related grief, loss, sadness, fear, etc., for the very first time is this time with what's happening in Ukraine, which is devastating. It will be more challenging knowing that there have been a few years worth of really tragic events as well. And so we need to be constantly building the runway for these types of conversations. And in my view, we can start at any time if we haven't done it yet. But the way to do it is to be checking in. How are you doing? I'm worried about you. I've noticed this. And you can even say that to your manager. I've noticed that you've been sharper with me than usual. If you have the rapport, say it. Why not? How are you doing? You're human. I'm also checking in on you. But one of the things we can do when we've never had those kinds of conversations before, we've never checked in or we've never called someone out, is we can really think about what we might want to say, script it in a very succinct way, memorize it so that the recall is easier and faster and we have less nervous system dysregulation. We're less in fight, flight, freeze. So we have faster recall because we practiced it first.
Awesome. And so moving to managers who are thinking about, how should I address, for example, the war in Ukraine? If they have started to pave the way already with the one-on-one discussions and the check-ins, and I think, a key piece of this also, maybe we could talk a little bit about psychological safety and creating that space on your team for having those conversations. What should a manager be doing and thinking about to kind of make the space for recognizing and recognizing what's happening in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing for me is for managers to demystify what it means to reach out and connect when something difficult happens in the world. When something really difficult happens in the world, we usually know, right? We're usually aware. And in that moment, for me as a manager, when I hear about an event or something like that, it triggers for me and instantly the desire to act on reaching out and connecting and checking in. And so I do that almost immediately, whether it's a shooting at a mosque or at a synagogue, or the invasion of a country, or the act of violence against Indigenous women, which is a crisis in Canada, or the violence against various racialized people in the US, and particularly the Black community. So, I check in specifically with the staff who I know have closest proximity to that event or that grief or pain or loss. So, for example, if there is an act of violence against the Muslim community, I check in with my Muslim staff. What I do personally is I check in, I say, I saw that, my heart sank. I connect it in empathy to an experience and my own experience to demonstrate that I can feel the depth that they might feel. So I might say something like, my heart sank when I saw that on the news today. It reminded me of 3 years ago when something similar happened in a Gurdwara Sikh temple. I'm really thinking about you. I understand that you're probably watching the news, reaching out to family, doing things like that today. Let me know how I can be there for you. With staff, here's the interesting thing. We might have large teams and we might not actually know the identities. So what was so funny was once well, not funny, but once I asked, something similar happened, and I asked the staff person that I had the greatest rapport with, do we have any other Muslim people on the team that I might not know about? Because they haven't shared who you feel would have a level of comfort with me reaching out to them. Now, I asked that of the person that I had the closest rapport with, because I know that I have the psychological safety with them where they wouldn't take offense to the question. And actually, they named a few people that I had no idea were Muslim. And so, of course, I reached out really briefly and said, I'm just thinking about you and I'm checking in. And what's fascinating is one of the most meaningful responses I had was from somebody who I didn't know was Muslim, but also they didn't know that I knew. And we were able to connect in resonance in that way for the first time. And so the one thing that I'd say is that you should be checking in, you should be asking, who should I be checking in with? And then you can do a sort of group wide check-in as well. And my assumption is the default when something really difficult is happening in the world, the default is accommodation that day or that week or that for that period of time. The default is accommodation. So if you need to have your cameras off, if we need to change the timing, if you need to have your phone on, if you need to rejig your day, if you just need to not have this meeting right now, if I need to give you the flexibility to rejig everything for you to get through the day and potentially longer for sure, depending, go ahead and do that. The other thing that I think is really important is, and I think is a really key strategy for folks, especially when they're going through a really difficult time that managers can really help out with, is to gather information about their mental health and EAP support resources. One of the things that I think happens a lot in management is when folks are depleted themselves or they don't know or they don't care, they'll say things like, have you looked at the EAP? Have you checked into the EAP? And they just leave it at that. And we know that from the research that sometimes people don't use the resources available to them. And one of the main reasons for that is that they're not aware and they don't really want to navigate the system to figure out which therapy is available to them or how much money they have or what kind of programming they offer. And I actually think that it's really high bang for buck for a manager to make a single phone call to the EAP and to gather all the information themselves. How many sessions? Is it a psychologist or a social worker? What kind of method? Is it group? Is there an app that accompanies that? Is there online support? What is the timing of it? What's on site? You have a psychologist on site a couple times a week or whatever it might be. These are the wellness programs. This is what the copay looks like. And gather that all at once and be able to use that in a more effective and caring and empathetic way when someone does say, I need help and support. To be able to provide that more detailed information is a kinder act in my view. Those are just a couple of strategies. I have a lot more, but you let me know.
Awesome. Yeah. Could you just say what EAP is for those who may not know?
Sure. Employee Assistance Program, which, obviously can be labeled many different ways. It's basically your benefits.
Awesome. So there's a few things in there, that I want to kind of address. One is I think it's important that when we're building relationships with people when we're, you mentioned, reaching out to Muslim colleagues when violence happens at a mosque, or when there's anti-Muslim hate happening in the world. Well, big incidences of hate happening in the world, and kind of sharing your own experience as a way to relate. And I also think it's important when we're doing that to not center our own experiences. And so there is a need to kind of decenter, especially for people who already come from marginalized backgrounds, have experiences with marginalization, to decenter and in those times. Can you talk a little bit about what you do to decenter?
Yeah, I mean, this is so, such an important question. And I love it because it cuts to the heart of the challenge and the responsibility of allyship and of empathy. How do we demonstrate, our support, care, and commitment to other people when they are in pain? And how do we use our power and resources and privilege to support others in the most impactful way, when we also have our own marginalization? And so one of the complexities here of allyship is that it involves fluid intersectionality. There will be moments when, for example, as a racialized woman, I require allies to show up for me. And there will be other moments when I need to decenter my own marginalization to create space for others, and potentially the others that I'm usually relying on as my allies, right? So there will be moments when we need to be really fluid in how we're showing up for other people, and when we, actually accept the position of also receiving allyship. And I think what we see in the war the war on the invasion of Ukraine is a really good example of this. So I wouldn't be thinking usually about what my eyes observe to be white, or so I'm not suggesting that the person would identify as white, but what my eyes clock as being a white male, for example. And our biases might suggest that this male person and their privilege that they hold might be better positioned to be an ally to me, for example, as a racialized woman. But what if that person is Ukrainian right now? What if that person has family in the Ukraine and is in crisis right now and devastated watching what's happening? How would I decenter myself? So in order to be truly empathetic, we need to understand how to decenter ourselves in our interactions with others that have closer proximity to pain or grief or loss. And one of the brilliant, simple frameworks that I have come across and love to share is ring theory, that it gives us a really good idea of how to decenter ourselves and how to truly show up with empathy and allyship for others. Ring theory was developed by a psychologist by the name of Dr. Susan Silk in response to her experience of cancer, wherein she often had conversations with people who meant well, but they made things about themselves in the conversation in a way that was taxing and unhelpful. So actions like giving advice or being toxically positive, it will get better, you'll be fine, that kind of thing, or taking up space with their own emotions or stories. And so we've all, seen examples of that, where the person is crying because they're going through pain and we feel empathy for them. So we cry even harder and they end up comforting us. So these can all be really, really unhelpful exchanges with people who mean well. And so Dr. Silk created a way of helping people understand when they need to step back and create room for other people. And so you can almost imagine a series of like concentric circles where you see in the center, you have the person who's the closest to the issue or the injustice or the event, like war currently. And then you see concentric circles of people who are more and more and more removed from the issue or the event or the injustice. So you might have Ukrainian people in Ukraine and as well as other residents of Ukraine and students in Ukraine right now, people who are actually there. And then in the concentric circles, you might have loved ones that have just recently escaped and are safe in other places in neighboring countries, but going through that crisis. And then you might have in the circle outside of that, loved ones who live in other countries, or immigrants to other countries, or are residents and citizens of other countries. And essentially, in building those concentric circles, you might have other people who've experienced war recently from other countries. And then in the outer layers, we might have people like myself who have noticed and seen and peripherally experienced war through extended family, but have personally never had the experience of war. And so what would happen is that the closer you are to the center, and the people at the center of those circles can actually emote, react in any way they want to and need to with whomever they feel comfortable doing so with. But as you move through those outer circles and you identify your own location in relation to the issue, we as allies and people being empathetic in the moment choose to only express ourselves, our emotions, our interests, and our ideas with people in our own circles and outer circles. Anyone that's more central and has closer proximity to the issue, the event, or the crisis gets the space to speak first. It's essentially, the model is like comfort in, dump out. You dump out, you do your own venting, your own processing, your own whatever it might be that you need to get out of your system, your own, emoting, and outer concentric circles and outer circles, not inwards. And that allows people to hold space. And so what that requires, again, is in empathy, that self-awareness of where do I sit in proximity to this issue? And right now, in the world with what's happening in the Ukraine and frankly, other countries as well, someone like me, I'm not in the inner concentric circles. I'm on the outer concentrics and the outer circles. And my position then as an ally with empathy is to hold space and to dump out, but hold space and allow people to react and be asking and checking in on them about what they need, and then showing up in action to provide that for them. And that's how we decenter ourselves, despite also having and experiencing our own marginalization.
Wow, that was super helpful. And so that's so important in all of the different situations that we've talked about. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing all of your wisdom today. I do have one more question as we come to a close here, which is that we always end with an action. So given all that we've talked about, I want to ask you, what action would you like people to take as they step away from this conversation and into their lives and their workplaces?
Oh my gosh, I have so many. I'm going to share one that I think is maybe a little bit outside of the box, but it's one that I think is really important to counteracting the pain that we see in the world, and building greater capacity for empathy and humanity, supporting humanity. And that is to learn more about the body, become more embodied, learn more about the body and the nervous system. I know it sounds really abstract and outside of the box, but I really believe that for many of us, the greatest barrier to empathy, the greatest barrier to showing up, the greatest barrier to applying for that job that we want, the greatest barrier to managing our temper when we've had the umpteenth frustration of the day, the greatest barrier to facing really difficult things that are happening in the world right now is that we don't understand how our brains work around stress, how we're affected by the difficulties that we see around us. And because we don't understand that, we don't know how to take care of each other. we don't know how to take care of ourselves, and then we don't know how to take care of each other. So my big grand takeaway, the subtle force behind what I do and how I do this work, and you notice it even in the conversation we've had right now, where I've repeatedly said nervous system. I've repeatedly said, take care of yourself. It's my hidden mission to support people to understand how we as humans come to be formed in our pain and trauma and challenges of the world around us, and how doing the work to understand that and unravel that is really at the heart of all things that will heal us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Komal. I really appreciate you, and thank you everyone for doing the work to create change in your community, in your workplace, in the world, in our world. Appreciate you. To learn more about this episode's topic, visit ally.cc. Allyship is a journey. It's a journey of self-exploration, learning, unlearning, healing, and taking consistent action. And the more we take action, the more we grow as leaders and transform our communities. So what action will you take today? Please share your actions and learning with us by emailing podcast@changecatalyst.co or on social media, because we'd love to hear from you. And thank you for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast and the YouTube channel and share this. Let's keep building allies around the world. Leading with Empathy and Allyship is an original show by Change Catalyst, where we build inclusive innovation through training, consulting, and events. Appreciate you listening to our show and taking action as an ally. See you next week.